The relatively underappreciated naval war in the United States Civil War generally favored the Federal fleet. There just weren't a lot of shipyards in the South, and so it was easier for the Union Navy to acquire and build vessels. But the Union Navy had a daunting task, as the Union's idea was to starve the Confederacy through a stifling blockade that required that the Union Navy cover some 2,500 miles of Confederate coastland. Instead of a series of fleet engagements, the Naval War and the Civil War was largely a series of small ship engagements that were trying to either break or hold that blockade. And in that fight, one of the most interesting stories is of the unique Confederate ironclad CSS Albemarle, whose brief service represented extraordinary daring and bravado on both sides. It's history that deserves to be remembered. By 1862, the larger and quickly growing Federal Navy was managing an effective, though not airtight, blockade, and the South was looking to overcome a numerical disadvantage by producing better quality ships, notably new ironclads. The CSS Virginia was built from the cut-down hull of the steam screw frigate USS Merrimac, which had been scuttled by the Union Navy in 1861 after being trapped in the harbor in Norfolk, Virginia. The ship was raised, its hull cut down, and a casemate built on top. In the March 1862 Battle of Hampton Roads, the Virginia proved devastating to wooden Federal warships, being virtually invulnerable to their cannon. While the subsequent battle between Virginia and the USS Monitor, the world's first battle between ironclads, was indecisive, the success against Federal wooden warships gave the Confederate Navy hope that they could break the Union blockade in North Carolina. Early in the war, a Union offensive had taken much of the coast of North Carolina, allowing them to build fortifications that could support the Federal fleet enforcing the blockade, especially a fortification at Plymouth along the Roanoke River upstream from Albemarle Sound on North Carolina's Inner Banks. Just a month after the Battle of Hampton Roads, the Confederate Navy awarded a contract to a 19-year-old naval engineer named Gilbert Elliott to build a Confederate ironclad boat on the Roanoke River that could defeat the Federal gunboats that were defending the Union fortifications at Plymouth. But the construction of the boat would be no mean feat. If the construction were to be on the river, the Union Navy would simply destroy it on the quay as it was being built. Instead, Elliott decided to build the boat in, essentially, a cornfield at a place called Edwards Ferry, far enough upriver and in shallow enough water that the Union gunboats could not reach it. That necessitated building the boat away from industry. Supply was an issue, especially the amount of iron needed to build the casemate. Elliott had to scrouge for iron, often going door to door asking for locals to donate their cast iron pans or plows, sometimes making that request at gunpoint. Elliott sketched a design that was finalized by John L. Porter, a Virginian and Navy veteran who had largely been responsible for the conversion of the Merrimac into the Virginia. Porter had been appointed chief constructor in the Confederate States Navy. Confederate naval officer James W. Cook was given command of the vessel and oversaw the construction. Construction began in January 1863. The boat was 158 feet long, slightly more than half of that of CSS Virginia, with a beam of just over 35 feet. While the casemate, sloped at 30 degrees, would be similar to Virginia, the new boat would mount just 2 guns, 6.4-inch double-banded Brooke rifles, a rifle-barreled muzzle-loading naval gun designed by John Mercer Brooke, chief of the Confederate Navy's Bureau of Ordnance. The Brooke rifles were mounted on swivels to the fore and aft. Each could fire one of 3 directions through portals with armored covers, giving a 180-degree field of fire that allowed one each to shoot forward and aft, or both to be fired in broadside. The guns were heavy, nearly 12,000 pounds, including the carriage. The boat's prow was designed as a ram that was intended to drive a hole beneath the waterline of an enemy vessel. Her single screw was driven by a steam engine that allowed her to make about 4 knots. She had a crew of 150 and a relatively shallow draft of just under 9 feet that would allow her to operate in the shallows and that would protect her from the larger deep-water ships of the Federal Navy. They decided to name the ship the CSS Albemarle after the town of Albemarle, North Carolina, which was named after the first Duke of Albemarle, who was a 17th century Englishman who was among the first to get a charter to establish a colony in the Carolinas. Construction took more than a year, and in that time the Union Navy became aware of the project. But the site was too far upriver for the Navy to respond, and the Army decided that it couldn't spare troops for an overland mission to attack the construction. Albemarle launched in April 1864, intent upon clearing the Roanoke River of Union vessels to facilitate an attack on the fortifications there by troops under the command of General Robert F. Hoke. The Union Navy had prepared for the new ironclad ram. First, obstacles had been placed at a narrows, intending to prevent Albemarle from reaching the Federal fleet. But the river was running high after heavy rains, and there was just enough river for Albemarle to clear the obstacles. Guns from nearby Union fortifications fired at her, but they were unable to penetrate the ironclad's armor. But the Union naval commander, Lieutenant Commander Charles W. Flusser, had another plan for the ironclad. Two Union steamers, USS Southfield and USS Miami, had been chained together to concentrate firepower and rush towards Albemarle. Cook recognized the trap and managed to maneuver Albemarle outboard of Southfield, bringing it dangerously close to the shore where Albemarle could become grounded. As the three boats collided, Albemarle's ram scraped across Miami's bow and smashed through Southfield's starboard side. The ram penetrated below the waterline and Southfield began to sink. The crew of Miami had to cut the chains tying the vessels together so as to not be taken down with Southfield. But Albemarle was caught, its ram trapped in Southfield's side. As Southfield sank, it started to bring Albemarle under with it. Taking advantage of Albemarle's predicament, Flusser personally fired a cannon point blank from Miami into the Albemarle. The explosive shell had a 10-second fuse. The shell struck Albemarle, bounced off its sloped iron armor, and landed at Flusser's feet. It exploded, killing him instantly. The crew of Miami tried to board Albemarle, but were driven back by musket fire. Albemarle was still going down with Southfield, but the steamer rolled as it hit the river bottom, freeing Albemarle. However, the bow had been pulled down so low that it could not lift fast enough to make a clean shot at Miami, which retreated. Thus the Southfield, in sinking, saved the Miami. But Albemarle had won the battle. The Union Navy retreated, and without the help of their guns, and with Albemarle's firing at them, the Union troops were defeated and the forts were taken on April 20th. Albemarle had another crack at the Union Navy on May 5th while escorting a vessel carrying Confederate troops. At the mouth of Albemarle Sound, named after the same British Duke, Albemarle, along with a small steamer and the transport, ran into a substantial squadron of 8 Federal gunboats, including USS Miami, the 4 largest of which mounted 60 cannons combined. The Federal cannon thundered, but were unable to pierce Albemarle's armor. The ram was struck by more than 500 shells, leaving its stack looking like Swiss cheese. Albemarle tried to ram USS Mattabesset, but the steamer avoided the ram. Albemarle was then rammed by the 200-foot steamer USS Sassacus. Sassacus rode up on Albemarle's bow, so much so that the ram seemed like it might sink. Cook reportedly yelled to his men, "Stand to your guns, and if we must sink, let us go down like brave men." Sassacus rode up on Albemarle for nearly 10 minutes, but a shot from Albemarle pierced Sassacus's boiler, and the ship filled with hot steam. Sassacus managed to float free, but Albemarle had escaped. A correspondent from Harper's Weekly was aboard Sassacus and wrote of the unsuccessful attempt to ram. No better opportunity than was here presented could have been desired for testing and deciding the mooted point as to the possibility of injuring an ironclad by ramming with a wooden ship. USS Miami tried to sink Albemarle with its spar torpedo, essentially an explosive on the end of a spar, but failed to score a hit. The Federals attempted to entangle Albemarle's propeller with a net, but a broken line fouled the plan. The small Confederate steamer was captured, but the troop transport and CSS Albemarle escaped. Only one member of Albemarle's crew had been killed in the battle, shot while looking out a portal, but Albemarle was damaged. Its aft gun had been broken off 18 inches from the end, although it continued to fire, and some of its metal plates from the hail of fire had started to buckle and were becoming detached. Albemarle went back to Plymouth for repairs, and Rear Admiral Samuel Lee, head of the Union Atlantic Blocking Squadron, hatched a new plan. William Barker Cushing had attended the U.S. Naval Academy from 1857 to 1861, but had not had a good career there, being kicked out for poor scholarship and pulling pranks. He'd been reinstated at the outset of the Civil War, and during the war he distinguished himself commanding gunboats, and he'd led several daring reconnaissance and raiding excursions into Confederate territories. Knowing his reputation, Admiral Lee sent for Cushing. Cushing proposed sending 2 small steam launches armed with spar torpedoes to attack the Albemarle while in port. It was a daring plan, more reminiscent of the commando raids of World War II than the U.S. Civil War. Cushing, whose brother had died at the Battle of Gettysburg and earned a Medal of Honor for his bravery, was reportedly a good friend of Charles Flusser, and was said to be eager to seek revenge for his friend's death. Cushing acquired 2 small steam launches in New York. The launches were 30 feet long, with a shallow draft of about 3.5 feet, and each was armed with a small howitzer and a spar torpedo, an explosive on a stick that, if they could sneak up close enough, could be used to hold Albemarle below the waterline. One of the boats was lost at sea on the way from New York, and so Cushing was forced to make the attempt the night of October 27th in just one of the boats. The launch, with Cushing and 7 crew, was accompanied by a small cutter with 15 more men. The Confederates used the wreckage of USS Southfield as a lookout post, and the men in the cutter were assigned to subdue the lookouts there, or, if necessary, the additional men might be used to board and take control of Albemarle. But it was rainy that night, and Cushing's group was not spotted as they passed the wreck. When they arrived at Albemarle that morning, they ran into an obstacle. Albemarle had been surrounded by a log barrier. As they approached, they were spotted by sentries, came under musket fire. Cushing wrote in his report, "The cutter was then cast off and ordered below while we made for our enemy under a full head of steam. Passing her closely, we made a complete circle so as to strike her fairly, and went into her bows on. By this time the enemy's fire was fairly severe, but a dose of canister at short range served to moderate their zeal and disturb their aim. 3 bullets struck my clothing, and the air seemed full of them." But Cushing was uncowed. According to Ensign Thomas Gay, even as they were under fire, Cushing yelled at the crew of Albemarle, "Leave the ram, or I will blow you to pieces." Cushing pushed his launch to full speed, hoping the logs in the barrier would be waterlogged and he could slide over them. Ensign Gay described the attack. "Having backed our boat sufficiently to get headway enough on her to jump the log pin which encircled the ram, we succeeded in jumping the logs and lowering the torpedo boom." Still resting on the logs and under constant fire, Cushing wrote, "The torpedo boom was then lowered, and by a vigorous pull I succeeded in diving the torpedo under the overhang and exploding it at the same time that the Albemarle's gun was fired." Because of the smoke, Cushing was unable to tell if the attack succeeded. He tried to back the boat out, but they were trapped by the log barrier. According to Ensign Gay, he yelled to the crew, "Men, save yourselves," before diving overboard himself. Ensign Gay tried to swim away, but the water was too cold. He and most of the raiders were captured, but Cushing managed to swim away. Cushing, keeping to his daring record, found and stole a skiff and escaped, reaching the blockade steamer USS Valley City. Only one other member of the raiding party, Seaman William Hoffman, made it back to Union lines. Cushing was able to write in his report, "The ram is now completely submerged, and the enemy have sunk 3 schooners in the river to obstruct the passage of our ships." A Confederate letter later captured by the Union described the damage. "The torpedo, bursting, blew a great hole in her some 6 feet long, sinking her almost instantly. She is now lying at the bottom of the Roanoke River. The crew lost everything they had, bed, clothing, and everything." Ensign Gay and the other Union officers that were captured were eventually paroled in February of 1865. At least 2 bodies of raiders were later recovered by the Union and buried with honors. With Albemarle sunk, the Union was able to recapture Plymouth, and the wreck of Albemarle was raised and her hull repaired. But Albemarle saw no further service and was finally scrapped for salvage in 1867. One of her Brooks rifled cannon is on display at the headquarters of the commander, U.S. Fleet Forces Command, at the Norfolk, Virginia Naval Base. William Barker Cushing received the thanks of Congress for his raid and became a national celebrity and moderately wealthy from the prize money for the eventual capture of the Albemarle. He distinguished himself again during the war in the January 1865 conquest of Fort Fish, North Carolina. He continued in the Navy after the war and played a notable role during the 1873 Virginia's affair with Cuba. He passed away in 1874 and is buried at the United States Naval Academy Cemetery. 5 U.S. Navy ships have been named in his honor. The story of the ironclad Confederate ram CSS Albemarle is interesting for so many reasons. This unique vessel, built in a cornfield, so vexed the Federal fleet, and the daring raid to sink her show how individual initiative can have such a powerful impact on larger events. You know, in the grand context of war, sometimes it's the actions of individual units in small encounters that are so much more interesting than great generals and grand strategies. The naval component of the United States Civil War is relatively forgotten compared to the land campaigns, but the war did test many new ship designs and technologies that heralded the future of naval warfare. In February of 1863, the Union Navy suffered a surprising reversal against the Confederate Navy, forcing the Union to deploy a new class of ship, the massive and intimidating Black Terror. Flying the skull and crossbone flags of a pirate, the cruise of the Black Terror is an example of history more interesting than fiction. History that deserves to be remembered. Control of the Mississippi River, which ran along both northern and southern states, was vital to the war effort.
For federal forces, control of the river would cut off Confederate forces in Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, and elsewhere west, along with denying the South the ability to move troops, trade, and supplies along one of the country's major trade routes. For the South, control of the river was just as vital. Without it, the country was cleaved in half, and they lost the ability to effectively defend or contest Missouri or move troops north by boat. Confederate General Braxton Bragg said, "The river is more important to us than all of the country together." For the Union, the battle in the West along the river was commanded by Ulysses S. Grant, who assumed command of the District of Southeast Missouri in September of 1861, headquartered at Cairo, Illinois. At Cairo, ship designer Samuel M. Pooke was working for the Navy Department. He had experience designing river craft, which few of the men in the department did, and he designed a set of vessels that would become the City-class ironclads, more commonly known as Pooke Turtles or Eads gunboats. While Pooke designed the ships, they were built in shipyards at Carondelet, Missouri, owned by wealthy St. Louis industrialist James Buchanan Eads. Eads was not the only person building ships for the Union Brown Water Fleet, as the Mississippi River Squadron would come to be known. In Cincinnati, another shipbuilder, Joseph Brown, signed an agreement with the U.S. government on April 30th, 1862, to build the USS Indianola. The ship was named after the town of Indianola, Iowa. Like the City-class ironclads, Indianola was a casemate ironclad. In the Battle of Hampton Roads between the Monitor and the former Merrimac, then called the Virginia, the Merrimac was a casemate ironclad, while the Monitor represented the Monitor type of warship, a small ship designed to sail in shallow waters and present as small a target as possible above the water. Casemate ironclads of the Mississippi Squadron generally followed the Virginia design, with a low-cut hull that sat close to the water surface. A casemate is a fortified defensive structure. The idea of the casemate ironclads was to build such a defensive emplacement atop a boat, making for a highly effective and defensible gun battery. By September of 1862, Brown reported that the Indianola was nearing completion. However, on September 2nd, a Confederate army occupied Covington, Kentucky. Union Major General Lew Wallace saw the army as a threat to Cincinnati, leading the Union to appropriate the unfinished ship and launch it for emergency defensive action on September 4th. The ship was commissioned on September 27th, and by October 23rd, the ship was declared armed and ready to defend Cincinnati, but remained incomplete. Ultimately, the Confederate Army didn't march on Cincinnati, and the Indianola was returned to Brown for completion. When it was finally completed in December of 1862, the ship was unable to join the Mississippi River Squadron until she arrived at Cairo, Illinois, on January 23, 1863. Indianola was a side-wheel steamer with 2 wheels for propulsion, but she also had 2 screw propellers. She could move faster upriver than most of the ships in the squadron. She was armed with 4 guns, 2 11-inch Dahlgren smoothbore cannons and 2 9-inch ones. A weakness in her design was that the guns had a slow rate of fire and were situated so she could only effectively fire fore and aft, but not broadside. In this early part of the war, the ships on both sides of the conflict had been hastily constructed or adapted from earlier civilian ships. This led to a seemingly anachronistic type of ship being used very frequently during the Civil War: rams. In fact, the Virginia's successful ramming of USS Cumberland led many nations to at least briefly begin fitting out ships with rams, thought to be an effective tactic since ironclad ships were initially remarkably immune to enemy cannon fire, even at close range. Both the Union and the Confederacy put rams into use. The North even formed the United States Ram Fleet for use on the river. Between January and March 1863, Grant was conducting his bayou operations, seeking to offer a water route south of the city that would keep the river gunboats from having to run the rebel blockade, where Confederate guns overlooked the river. The Union had at this point blockaded both ends of the river, controlling everything north of Vicksburg and maintaining a blockade in the Gulf, a cork to the river's exit. But the South still controlled hundreds of miles of the river between Vicksburg and Port Hudson, Louisiana, including the Red River, which flowed from the west to connect the South with her western territory. Rear Admiral David Porter, son of a controversial Commodore who fought in the War of 1812, had been given command of the Mississippi River Squadron and chafed at the criticism that he was the greatest humbug of the war and that he had failed to do anything useful. The Assistant Secretary had promised that Porter would be made a full admiral if he could take control of the river. So in February, Porter ordered the ram USS Queen of the West to conduct operations south of Vicksburg, especially to control the Red River. Queen of the West ran the blockade and captured several supply ships bound for Vicksburg. She also rammed and seriously damaged the CSS Vicksburg. On February 14th, the Queen entered the Red River, capturing the steamboat Era No. 5, which was carrying 4,500 bushels of corn. She continued upriver to investigate reports of Confederate ships and was caught under heavy fire by a Confederate fort. Ordered to back down river, she ended up grounded on the right bank under direct and heavy fire. Forced to abandon ship, the crew escaped by floating downriver on bales of cotton until they were picked up by another Union ship, the DeSoto, which then also ran aground. The crew took over Era Number 5 and began fleeing downriver, pursued by the Confederate ram CSS Webb. The Indianola, under the command of Lieutenant Commander George Brown, had been ordered to join the Queen of the West and had run the Vicksburg blockade on the night of February 13th. She was chosen thanks to her greater speed upriver, which would allow her to retreat in case of trouble. She sailed with 2 large barges strapped to her side, both loaded with coal. On February 16th, Era Number 5 reached the Indianola on the Mississippi. She had no coal left and only kept up steam by burning corn as fuel. Captained by Lieutenant Commander George Brown, the Indianola went after the Webb and spotted her at Ellis Cliffs, opening fire. Webb proved to be out of range and disappeared around a bend of the river, further protected by a heavy fog. The following day, Indianola followed the Webb to where the Mississippi and Red River joined. For several days, she blockaded the mouth of the river, keeping Webb from causing any trouble. However, after several days, the crew learned that the Webb had been reinforced with a refloated Queen of the West. The Union wren had been abandoned, but not set aflame, as the first mate remained on board, too injured to move. The ship was relatively easy to return to service. Indianola retreated upriver, but was slowed by the barges of the coal that she towed. She hoped that they would be able to resupply any reinforcements sent from the river squadron. February 24th, still south of Vicksburg, Webb and Queen caught up near Davis Bend, a peninsula that extended into the river. They were reinforced by 2 other steamers. In fact, the Confederate ships could have caught up earlier, but they waited, hoping that the Indianola would take fire from the Confederate shore batteries and to launch their attack at night. Both ships were loaded with men and field artillery and were under the command of Major Joseph Brent. On the night of February 24th, Indianola sighted the oncoming armada. The maneuverable ship came about, putting one of the coal barges between herself and the oncoming rams. First came Queen of the West, which rammed the coal bar and cleaved it in half, doing little damage to Indianola. Webb charged next, and Lieutenant Commander Brown stood for her at full speed, and both vessels came together bows on with a tremendous crash, which knocked nearly everyone down aboard both vessels. Rifle fire came through portholes. Webb rammed again, this time sinking the second coal barge. Queen rammed again as well, shearing off the starboard rudder and caving in the wheel housing. Indianola was in trouble, listing heavily to one side as water poured in. The moon was partially obscured by a veil of white clouds, Major Brent recalled, which made it difficult for Indianola's cannons to find a target, though they fired. Reports are unclear if they hit anything or were able to damage the enemy ships. Webb struck again, damaging Indianola's stern. Lieutenant Commander Brown ran about the deck, commanding his men and firing his pistol at the enemy's pilot, despite the rifle fire and canister shot. Ultimately, she was rammed 7 times, and as Confederate soldiers prepared to board, Brown shouted, "For God's sake, don't shoot anymore! I've surrendered!" Brown had attempted to sink the ship in deep water to prevent her capture, but the Confederate ships were able to drag her so that she sank in relatively shallow water near Palmyra Island. Only 1 Union soldier was killed, but only 3 managed to escape, and the rest were captured. A team was set to repair and refloat Indianola, including slaves sent from a nearby plantation owned by Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Porter, upriver, was faced with a disaster. 2 of his ships were gone, one already afloat in Confederate hands. Loss of the Indianola to the enemy was unacceptable and promised to threaten success on the river altogether. Vicksburg celebrated. Piping and dancing had been the order of the night every night this week, reported the publisher of the Vicksburg Daily Whig. Admiral Farragut blamed Porter, saying that he allowed his boats to come down one at a time and had been captured by the enemy. Porter, in turn, blamed the captains of Queen and Indianola. "I can give good orders, but I cannot give officers good judgment," he fumed. Gideon Welles, Secretary of the Navy, didn't care whose fault it was and ordered a force to be sent to prevent Indianola from being salvaged. Porter, however, didn't think he had the ships to do it. 2 more of his rams were out of service thanks to enemy batteries, and none of his remaining ships could match Webb or Queen for speed. So he came up with a new plan, the creation of the Black Terror. His men set to work finding a flatbed or a coal barge. Logs were loaded on to give the ship the appearance of a hull, and canvas and wood created a casemate and padded wheel housings. An outhouse became a pilot house. Broken rescue boats were tied on. Blackened logs were loaded aboard as cannons, and smokestacks are created out of pork barrels. The whole ship was blackened with tar, and 2 pots were ignited to make it appear that smoke was pouring from the smokestacks. The Black Terror was possibly the largest warship ever to sail on the Mississippi River during the war. It bristled with weapons, built in just 12 hours, at a total cost of $8.63. At 11 p.m. on February 25th, the Black Terror was towed out to the river. According to an article in America's Civil War magazine by Donald Barnard, the ship had large words painted on the boathouse that read, "Deluded people, cave in," and flew a skull and crossbones flag in addition to a U.S. one. Without a crew, the ship was cut loose and sent down the Mississippi. At Vicksburg, surprised gunners were awoken to the call that an ironclad was running the blockade. Never did the batteries of Vicksburg open with such a din, Porter wrote later. The earth fairly trembled, and shot flew thick and fast around the devoted Monitor. The rudderless ship did strike the west bank when south of Vicksburg, but Union soldiers pushed her back into the current. On the approach of the ship, Queen immediately turned tail and ran, damaging a transport in a hurry. The salvage crew was abandoned, possibly drunk and in a panic. They threw two of the ship's guns into the river, pointed the larger guns against each other and fired them, and set the ship aflame. Exploded loud enough for Porter to hear upriver. Confederate colonel wrote that with the exception of the wine and liquor stores of the Indianola, nothing was saved. The valuable armament, the large supplies of powder, shot, and shell were all lost. The Black Terror sailed 2 miles further and struck a mud bank. When no one came on deck, some men sailed out and found the ship a complete fake. "Laugh and hold your sides, lest you die of a surfeit of derision," stated the Richmond Examiner. Blown up because, forsooth, a float boat of mud scow with a small house taken from the back garden of a plantation put on top of it is floated down the river before the frightened eyes of the partisan rangers.
And so disaster was turned into victory. The Queen of the West and the Webb retreated up the Red River, removing the immediate threat, and both would be destroyed in separate engagements before the end of April. Within a few months, Vicksburg and Port Hudson would fall, giving the Union control of the Mississippi River. The Indianola was salvaged in 1865. Its remains sold. When speaking of the victory, Admiral Porter, who was the foster brother of David Farragut, who would go on to serve as superintendent of the United States Naval Academy and whose eventual 62-year career was amongst the longest in U.S. naval history, said merely of the Black Terror that it was a cheap expedient, which worked out very well. I don't think any military commander in history can claim to have gotten better military return out of an investment of $8.63. War represents humanity at its most exposed, with that juxtaposition between heroism and horror. One thing that isn't often discussed is the connection between war and the strongest of human emotions, love. War reveals that bond between brothers in arms, or even between enemies across a field of shared sacrifice, or the strength of love that can develop when ordinary people are exposed to extraordinary circumstances. Maybe it is that period of great sacrifice, or the fear that you might not live to see another day, that reminds us of what is most precious. That time when George Custer attended a Confederate wedding during the Civil War is history that deserves to be remembered. George Custer had a strange path into the military. He grew up in a large family where the siblings played pranks on each other. The Detroit News wrote in 2013, Custer had 3 younger brothers and a sister. It was a rough and tumble existence. Armstrong's brothers and his father, who was described as a childish himself, constantly teased and played practical jokes on each other well into adulthood. But his childhood was marred by the death of his mother. The news continues. His mother died when they were children, so Custer's half-sister, Lydia Ann, who was 14 years older, became his surrogate mother. At the age of 14, George, called Auntie by his family, lived with Lydia Ann and her husband, David Reed, to attend school. He graduated from normal school at the age of 17. Auntie wanted to be a soldier and attend the United States Military Academy at West Point, but there was a problem. The website HistoryNet explains, the only hitch was that Custer needed the requisite congressional appointment, but the local congressman was a staunch Republican, and the Custers, staunch Democrats. But salvation came in an interesting way. He started an affair with a local girl. Her father was an influential Republican, and he secured Custer's appointment to West Point in order to keep him away from his daughter. George has been described as West Point's worst cadet. Not only did he not take his studies seriously, but he remained a merry prankster who led the academy in demerits. Historian Hal Funk, writing in the Springfield News Leader, wrote, if he'd had a few more demerits, he would have been completely dismissed. In fact, he seemed to know exactly how many demerits he had. A cadet would be expelled if he reached 100 demerits in 6 months. History.net notes, Custer earned 90 citations in only 3 months, but managed to restrain himself for the next few months without a single misdeed. At one point, he managed to get by with 98. Custer had more fun, gave his friends more anxiety, he walked more tours of extra duty, and came nearer to being dismissed than any other cadet I've ever known, a classmate recalled. Custer himself would later write, "My career as a cadet had but little to recommend it to the study of those who came after me, and less as an example, to be carefully avoided." But for all his pranking, Custer was popular with other cadets. As HistoryNet notes, what Custer lacked in academic excellence, he made up for in popularity as a cadet. Custer made many friends at the academy. Among them was John Willis Lee. A gimlet is a small tool for drilling holes, and Lee had been given the nickname Gimlet because he was tall and thin. There's little record of their dealings together at the academy, but as would become clear, they must have become close friends. Custer did poorly on his exams, although he excelled at horsemanship and cavalry skills. He might never have graduated, given his academic record and his eventual total of 726 demerits. But, History.com explains, the Union needed officers to fight its newly begun Civil War. George Custer graduated at the bottom of his class, 34th out of 34, in 1861. The website Essential Civil War History writes, "The loudest and most enthusiastic hurrah for any cadet of the U.S. Military Academy graduation of 1861 came when the name George Armstrong Custer was announced. Many of his fellow students and instructors doubted that he would receive a diploma. After all, he'd been the class clown, a prankster who had finished last in his class due to his fun-loving personality. But Custer was also the most popular man in his class." But his friend Gimlet Lee didn't graduate. A North Carolinian, he had resigned from the academy to join the Confederacy. He was made a captain of Company I of the 5th North Carolina Infantry Regiment. George Custer was commissioned a second lieutenant. The Detroit News writes, he returned to Detroit in 1861 a second lieutenant and met with Michigan Governor Austin Blair at the Michigan Exchange Hotel for approval to join the Michigan Cavalry as an officer. Detroit historian Silas Farmer noted that Blair was distrustful of Custer's flowing blonde hair and otherwise effeminate appearance, but eventually signed his approval. Custer joined the 2nd United States Cavalry, with whom he participated in the July 21st First Battle of Bull Run. By May of 1862, Custer joined the staff of Major General George McClellan in the Peninsular Campaign. Custer was among those brave enough to reconnoiter in the gas-filled observation balloons and among the first Union officers to discover that Confederate troops under General Joseph Johnston had abandoned their defensive positions around Yorktown, retreating to defend the Confederate capital at Richmond. McClellan ordered a pursuit, leading to the Battle of Williamsburg. One of the first pitched battles of the Civil War, a force of some 41,000 Federals attacked an approximately 32,000-strong Confederate rear guard protecting Johnston's retreat. The battle was quite bloody and inconclusive. While the Union made some gains, especially when General Winfield Scott Hancock's brigade threatened the Confederate flank, the Federals were not able to follow up, and Johnston's army was able to continue its retreat. George led a charge during the battle. The Essential Civil War curriculum writes, soon after, Custer was serving on the staff of Brigadier General Winfield Scott Hancock when the Union troops were ordered to charge into a line of Confederate soldiers at Williamsburg. The anxious Union troops hesitated. Custer impatiently spurred his horse and burst from their midst to lead the charge. The Union soldiers obediently followed this gallant one-man charge, which resulted in routing the Confederates into retreat. Custer later returned to friendly lines with a captured officer and 5 enlisted men, and the real trophy, a Confederate battle flag. The flag appears to have been abandoned on the field and handed to Custer by an enlisted man, yet it was the first Confederate battle flag of the war captured by the Army of the Potomac. McClellan called Custer's charge a gallant affair and complimented Custer personally. After, Custer was surveying the field in an area where a confused Confederate attack had been devastated by Union fire. Historian Carson Hudson of the Williamsburg Battlefield Trust explains, they had been hurrying forward towards the fighting and had lost contact with the rest of their brigade after they entered a thick and tangled piece of forest. Trying to find their way, they emerged onto a large muddy field and found themselves under a murderous fire from a sizable Union force on their left. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Badham, ordered his men to turn and charge, but as they changed their direction and began to advance, Colonel Badham went down, shot through the forehead. His men fared no better. Moving forward through the mud, the 5th North Carolina was shot to pieces, losing over 300 men killed and wounded in just a few minutes. A 2013 issue of the Chicago Tribune writes, after the bloody assault that failed to dislodge Hancock from Redoubt No. 11, Custer joined many of the horrified but curious Union men picking through a killing field so thickly covered with fallen Southern soldiers that it was hard to avoid stepping on the dead and wounded. As he made his way across the grim landscape, he discovered the bloody form of a West Point classmate. When George found Gimlet Lee shot through the legs, Hudson writes in his 2019 book, Hidden History of Williamsburg, people thought they were brothers. Custer wrote to Lydia on the 15th. When we first saw each other, he shed tears and threw his arms around my neck, and we talked of old times and asked each other hundreds of questions about classmates on opposing sides of the conflict. I carried his meals to him, gave him stockings of which he stood in need, and some money. This he did not want to take, but I forced it on him. He burst into tears and said it was more than he could stand. His last words to me were, "God bless you, old boy." The bystanders looked with surprise when we were talking and afterwards asked if the prisoner were my brother. Lee, overcome with gratitude, wrote in Custer's journal, Williamsburg, 5/6/62. If ever Lieutenant Custer, USA, should be taken prisoner, I want him treated as well as he has treated me. Lee's wound would change his life. In a 1930 interview, Williamsburg resident Zachary Goodrich Durfee, 14 years old at the time of the battle, recalled, "There wasn't a hospital or anything of the kind here to take care of the wounded. The Confederate and the Yankees were all down in a barn, and my father went down. He heard that men were suffering there, and he took his carriage down and asked if he could bring up some of the wounded soldiers to his house." His father was the well-to-do Colonel Goodrich Durfee, a supporter of the Confederacy, who owned a house in Williamsburg called Bassett Hall, named after a previous owner, Burwell Bassett, nephew of Martha Washington. And one of the soldiers he brought back to his home to recover was Captain Lee. There he would be cared for by the colonel's 17-year-old daughter, Margaret. A friend of the Durfees named Harriet Carey described Lee and another officer taken there. "Spent the rest of the day at Colonel D's, where there are two of our wounded. Very interesting gentlemen. Captain Lee and Lieutenant Hayes, both doing quite well. The former, the happiest soul I ever saw." And that happiness had everything to do with Margaret Durfee. Hudson wrote, "By the end of the month, Lee was able to get around on crutches, and within the next 2 months, having secured the permission of her father, he and Margaret announced their engagement." Meanwhile, Lieutenant Custer had returned to his duties. In May, he encountered another Confederate friend from West Point, Lieutenant James Barrell Washington, George Washington's great-grandnephew and an aide-de-camp to General Johnston, who had been captured at the May 31st Battle of Seven Pines. When the two met, they talked for several hours, and Custer had their picture taken. In June, the dashing Lieutenant Custer was promoted to the rank of captain. In August, he would see Gimlet Lee again. The website Emerging Civil War explains, "When the Army of the Potomac withdrew back through Williamsburg following the 7 days' battles, Custer, now a brevet captain serving on George McClellan's staff, sought for and received permission to locate Gimlet Lee. Custer found him a prisoner on parole at Bassett Hall. After visiting for an evening, Custer returned to camp and received permission to visit Lee again. When he arrived again at Bassett Hall, Lee informed Custer that he was to be married to Margaret and requested that Custer join the wedding party as groomsman." The Chicago Tribune writes, "The couple decided to move their marriage up by a week and married the next evening, with Custer standing up as Lee's best man." Margaret's cousin Maggie was the bridesmaid. Custer said of them, "I never saw two prettier girls." Custer described the ceremony in a letter to Lydia. "Lee was dressed in a bright new rebel uniform, trimmed with gold lace. I wore my full uniform of blue. The minister arrived at 9 and we took our places on the floor. Lee made the responses in a clear and distinct tone. The bride made no response whatever except to the first question. She was evidently confused, though she afterward said, laughing, that she neglected to respond purposely so as to be free from any obligations. When Lee noticed that the bridesmaid was crying, he suggested it was because she wasn't married, and then suggested that she marry George right there on the spot. He said George would be happy to carry such a pretty bride away from the Confederacy. She responded, according to Custer, "Why, Captain Lee, you are just as mean as can be." George obtained permission for leave, spent another 2 weeks at the house. He wrote Lydia that he never had a more pleasant visit among strangers. They played cards, Lee winning every time. Maggie tried, apparently, to rib Auntie by playing Confederate tunes, but even the tune Dixie didn't seem to disturb him. In September, he wrote Lydia, "The approach of the rebel army to Williamsburg and the departure of our army rendered a longer stay dangerous in more ways than one. Lee has been exchanged, is now back again with the rebel forces, fighting for what he supposes to be right." William Gimlet Lee would be wounded 2 more times during the Civil War, in the May 1863 Battle of Chancellorsville and then in the September 1864 Third Battle of Winchester. He ended the war a colonel in command of the 5th North Carolina Infantry. In April 1865, he was an acting brigade commander at the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse. George was there too, by then a brevet major general, the youngest in the history of the United States Army. Hudson writes that Gimlet joined Ottey in his tent for dinner the night of April 9th, after Robert E. Lee's surrender, and they talked of old times. After the war, John Willis Lee became an Episcopal priest, and he and Margaret raised 6 children. Margaret passed away in 1883, and Lee passed away in 1884 from blood poisoning at the age of 45. George Custer would have his own love story, marrying Elizabeth Clift Bacon in February 1864. He died in combat, fighting the Sioux in the June 25, 1876 Battle of the Greasy Grass. Among his effects left behind was his incomplete memoir, leaving unfinished his personal description of the Battle of Williamsburg. On July 21st, 1861, forces of the Union and the Confederacy met in the first major battle of the United States Civil War. Called the Battle of Bull Run in the north and the Battle of Manassas in the south, the battle dashed early Union hopes of a quick victory over the Confederacy. But mostly what the battle did was illustrate to both sides that the war would be long, expensive, and bloody. Much less remembered as the second major battle of the United States Civil War. The Battle of Wilson's Creek was notable for several reasons, but like the Battle of Bull Run, fought just 20 days before, it would illustrate to both sides that the war would be far more costly than anyone had imagined. The August 10th, 1861 Battle of Wilson's Creek deserves to be remembered. Missouri received surprisingly scant attention in the general study of the Civil War. It shouldn't. Missouri was more than just a divided border state. Missouri had been admitted as a slave state under the Missouri Compromise in 1821, a decision partly related to the early French colonial history in the area, but also largely to migration following the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. The state had become in many ways the epicenter of the debate between abolition and slavery, with the murder of abolitionist publisher Elijah Lovejoy in 1837 and the central role the state played in the landmark court case Dred Scott versus Sanford, which, among other important rulings, struck down the Missouri Compromise as unconstitutional. By the outbreak of the Civil War, the demographics of Missouri had changed substantially. Slavery was still an important part of the state's economy, and slaves represented nearly 10% of the state's population, but slavery was mostly restricted to the more southern and rural parts of the state. There was a notable abolitionist sentiment that was growing, mostly among the newly arrived Irish and German immigrants. But the largest sentiment was one common to border states: to stay out of the war. On January 21st, 1861, the legislature passed an act calling for a state convention to consider relations between the government of the United States and the government and people of the state of Missouri, and to adopt such measures for vindicating the sovereignty of the state and the protection of its institutions as shall appear to them to be demanded. The act stated that delegates to the convention would be elected by popular vote on February 18th, 1861, and were to convene in Jefferson City on February 28th, 1861. The purpose of the convention was simply to consider whether to secede from the Union. But the majority elected supported the Union, and secession was rejected by an overwhelming vote. Missouri was the only state during the U.S. Civil War to call upon a convention to consider secession without actually following through with secession. Rather, the convention preferred a different stance: remain in the Union, retain slavery in the state, reject violence from both sides, and refuse to provide arms, soldiers, or material support to either. But both the Union and the Confederacy understood that the Mississippi River would be important strategically, making the large city of St. Louis on the Mississippi River a critical military objective. And the people of the state were deeply divided. Like other border states during the war, Missouri would find out that staying out of the war was impossible. Central to the state's position at the time was Governor Claiborne Fox Jackson. Jackson had run in the fall of 1860 as a Douglas Democrat. Stephen Arnold Douglas had run in the 1860 presidential election as a Democrat who supported popular sovereignty, the idea that each state should be allowed to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery within their borders. Douglas's position was, essentially, to prevent secession by the South by guaranteeing that the federal government would not involve itself in the issue of slavery. His message failed nationally. Of the 4 presidential candidates in 1860 to win electoral votes, he earned the least. But his message resonated in Missouri, the only state he won in 1860. To many, the election of Abraham Lincoln essentially guaranteed secession and civil war. But Jackson, elected on a ticket seen as one trying to prevent war, was sympathetic to the cause of the Confederacy and hoped to goad the state into secession. When the Missouri Convention refused secession, he began communications with the President of the Confederacy, with a plan to seize St. Louis, and most importantly, the federal armory there, and hand the state to the Confederacy. Jackson started raising units of the state militia, a right guaranteed under the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution. Ostensibly, the purpose of the militia was to protect Missouri's neutrality and protect the state from incursions by both federal forces and Confederate forces. But in reality, Jackson had appointed Confederate sympathizers to command in the militia and intended to use the militia to seize the city of St. Louis. Jackson had units of the state militia form around St. Louis to train. Secretly, he had negotiated with the Confederacy to provide the militia with heavy artillery needed to breach the thick walls of the federal arsenal. But the plan was derailed by a commander of Union forces in St. Louis, Captain Nathaniel Lyon. By some accounts, Lyon, suspecting the militia's purpose, spied on them dressed as a farm woman. Having discovered the artillery, he led a force of pro-Union militia and U.S. regulars and captured the camp, surrounding them and forcing them to surrender. Lyon marched the captured and disarmed men through the city to the arsenal, where he planned to parole them and order them to disperse. But a crowd of pro-Confederate citizens became rowdy and eventually started throwing objects at the Union militia. Eventually, the conflict escalated. By some accounts, a drunk man fired into the Union troops, but other accounts say that the militia fired without provocation. But in the end, 28 civilians were killed and another 75 wounded in the Camp Jackson affair. While Lyon's action had saved the arsenal and possibly the state from Confederate capture, it also raised the state's ire. In May, the legislature passed the military bill. The bill reorganized the state militia into the Missouri State Guard and gave Governor Jackson wide power as commander of the Guard. The Guard was placed under the field command of former Missouri Governor Sterling Price and was supposed to defend Missouri territory from incursion by forces of the Union or Confederacy, especially an anticipated invasion by federal forces. The law also forbade the creation of other militias within the state to prevent the recruiting of pro-Union militia like those that had been involved in the Camp Jackson affair. Fearing that Missouri would side to the Confederacy, Brigadier General William Harney, commander of the U.S. Army Department of the West, negotiated an agreement that said, essentially, that the U.S. Army would stay in St. Louis and the Missouri State Guard would control the rest of the state. But the so-called Price-Harney truce could not last. Jackson, who theoretically swore allegiance to the Union and was governor of a state that had rejected secession, openly allowed recruiting for the Confederate Army and did not stop abuses against Union supporters. Harney was called back to Washington, and Lyon was promoted to brigadier general and given command of the Department of the West. Minor battles were fought between the Missouri State Guard and federal troops in June and July. While little more than skirmishes, the battles of Boonville and Carthage were unique. These were not fought between the Union and the Confederacy, but between the Union and the Missouri State Guard, officially under the authority of a state that had specifically rejected secession. Jackson himself commanded the Missouri State Guard at Carthage. A sitting governor had not commanded troops in battle in the United States since the War of 1812. These small engagements represented a unique war within a war. This was not a fight between the Union and the Confederacy, but a fight between federal troops and Missouri State Guard tasked with protecting Missouri's neutrality. But in reality, Jackson and Price weren't neutral at all. Not only were they Confederate sympathizers, they were negotiating with the Confederacy to facilitate an invasion of Missouri. But the legislature had finally had enough. Meeting again in July, they once again voted against secession, but also declared the governor's office vacant, in essence exiling Jackson. Hamilton Gamble, who had been Chief Justice of the Missouri Supreme Court during the Dred Scott case, was appointed governor. By the end of July, Jackson had convinced the Confederate Army to invade Missouri, and Missouri State Guard camped near the southwestern Missouri town of Springfield. The mixed Missouri, Arkansas, and Confederate force numbered some 12,000. Nearby, Lyon was camped with some 5,400 Federals. Realizing that he was outnumbered more than 2 to 1, Lyon planned to retreat to the city of Rolla, some 100 miles away, to await reinforcements. The Confederate force, now in the command of Confederate Brigadier General Benjamin McCulloch, planned an attack for November 10th, but the rain on the night of the 9th compelled them to call off the attack. But Lyon surprised them in the morning with an attack intended to delay any pursuit of his retreat to Rolla. The attack came on a Confederate camp along a small stream called Wilson's Creek. It was the first major battle of the U.S. Civil War west of the Mississippi. The federal plan was a surprise attack. Lyon would attack the Confederate camp at dawn, but he had detached some 1,200 men under Colonel Franz Sigel to do a flanking maneuver. It was a risky plan, as it meant splitting a federal force already outnumbered by the enemy. The two forces would be separated with no clear line of communication. In theory, the Federal forces, although outnumbered, were better trained and equipped than the Confederate force. At first, the Federal plan succeeded. In the confusion of their canceled attack the previous night, the Confederates had neglected to put out pickets and were caught by surprise. Lyon quickly overran the camp, taking the high ground of what would be called Bloody Hill. But a battery of artillery from the Arkansas militia managed to check the Federal advance, allowing Price to organize the Missouri State Guard and prevent a rout. Price attempted to retake the hill in a series of frontal attacks, each repulsed, with heavy losses. Sigel's attack also had initial success, surprising and routing the Confederate cavalry in their camp. But his force was taken by surprise. The Union force included an Iowa infantry regiment that wore gray uniforms. When Sigel saw a force approaching, he assumed it was the 1st Iowa, but the men were in fact Confederates of the 3rd Louisiana. Sigel's troops held fire until the force was almost upon them, and Sigel's flank collapsed. Sigel's force was forced to withdraw, in disarray. The main Union force on Bloody Hill was now on its own. Lyon, who had been wounded twice in the heavy fighting, tried to lead a counterattack, but was shot through the heart. He was the first Union general officer to be killed in combat in the Civil War. While they still held a defensible position, Major Samuel D. Sturgis, now in command, realized that his troops were running short of ammunition and decided to withdraw. After a 6.5-hour battle, the Confederates held the field. The Battle of Wilson's Creek was notable for a couple of reasons. It was only the second major battle of the war and the first to be fought west of the Mississippi River. Like Bull Run, the defeat shocked the Union, and like Bull Run, the defeat illustrated to both sides that the war would not be easily won. Despite holding the field, the Confederate Army had taken nearly as many casualties as the Union Army had, and short on supply, especially ammunition, and not having faith in the training of the Missouri State Guard, the Confederates were unable to follow up the Union retreat to Rolla. The victory essentially ceded southwest Missouri to the Confederacy, and it facilitated a victory as far north as Lexington, Missouri, but further defeats in October compelled both the Confederate Army and Sterling Price's Missouri State Guard to abandon the state, and a defeat at the Arkansas Battle of Pea Ridge the following March essentially dashed any Confederate hopes of retaking Missouri. Jackson convinced a small group of pro-Confederate delegates to pass an ordinance of secession in October, but the group was never recognized by the majority of the state. The secession government applied for and on November 28, 1861 was granted admission to the Confederacy as the purported 12th state of the Southern Federal Republic. The government in exile sent legislators to the Congress of the Confederate States, and Missouri was represented by the 12th star on the Confederate flag. Jackson himself died of pneumonia in December 1862. But Missouri remained contested throughout the war, and not just by armies, but in the particularly bloody and vicious attacks by and reprisals against the irregular forces called Missouri Bushwhackers. Counting small actions, there were more than 1,200 separate engagements inside the borders of the state of Missouri during the Civil War. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.